Emergency which service? Do you need fire, police or ambulance? What number have you dialed, please? I cannot release your line until you say that you do not need an emergency service. If you're unable to speak but need an emergency service, please tap the handset, cough, and make a noise.
This is the police. If you require any emergency service, please press 55 on your keypad now. Please release this call.
Harassment and stalking. I'm Barrister Daniel Barnett and I'm going to be explaining to you what the criminal definitions of harassment and stalking are. This is different from the colloquial definitions, it's different from the definition of harassment in employment law and some other areas of law. We are dealing specifically with the criminal law surrounding the offences of harassment and stalking. The words harassment and stalking are often used by people to describe what colloquially is known as creepy or slightly disturbing behaviour. But the criminal law has a very precise definition of both harassment and stalking. The definitions are slightly less straightforward than what we understand in ordinary conversation. So when could something that somebody might call harassment turn into something that you could be arrested for and charged with a criminal offence for doing? Just because somebody says they feel harassed by you doesn't mean you've committed a criminal offence and doesn't mean you've harassed them in law. The definition is very specific and it can be found at sections 1 and 1A of the Protection from Harassment Act 1997. The Protection from Harassment Act says, "A person must not pursue a course of conduct which amounts to harassment of another and which he knows or ought to know amounts to harassment of the other." It goes on to say at section 1A, "A person must not pursue a course of conduct which involves harassment of two or more persons and which he knows or ought to know involves harassment of those persons, and by which he intends to persuade any person not to do something that he is entitled or required to do, or to do something that he's not under any obligation to do." Right, so that's all a bit headache-inducing, so let's try to break that down into its constituent parts. First of all, harassment has to be a course of conduct. Now that means not one episode of harassment, but at least two. There've got to be at least two things that amount to harassment for it to become a course of conduct rather than an episode of conduct. So a single episode of harassment, no matter how bad, can't without more amount to a criminal offence. Of course, with more, for example, with threats of physical violence or indeed actual physical violence, it can be a separate criminal offence, but it won't be the offence of harassment. Now, just because two or more things have happened doesn't mean it's part of a course of conduct. The prosecution has to prove they're connected in some way. So how closely related were they in time? Are they part of a series of actions designed to achieve a particular aim on the part of the harasser or calculated to change the behaviour of the person being harassed? The court will look at how closely connected they all are to decide whether it amounts to a course of conduct. Conduct can mean pretty much anything. It can mean words, actions, texts, emails, WhatsApp messages. It's a very, very wide word. So if I kept phoning you in the middle of the night, that's much more likely because of the proximity in time to amount to a course of conduct than if I phoned you once every 3 months over the course of a couple of years. That would be unlikely to amount to a course of conduct because it doesn't have sufficient regularity about it. The behaviour has to amount to the harassment of another. Just because somebody feels harassed doesn't necessarily mean it will amount to the harassment of another. A magistrate or a judge will decide whether it is sufficiently serious to amount to harassment, and they look at the way that a reasonable person would view the situation.